You're stuck with me this morning. And if you don't like it this morning, too bad, because you're stuck with me tonight, too. Can you hear me, Bobby? Okay. I want to tell you a little story before we start. There was a family that they were getting ready. The mother was getting everything ready to have the preacher over for dinner. And the little boy was asking Mom several questions. What are we going to have, this and that. She asked him, said, I want you to say the prayer when the preacher comes over. He said, oh, Mom, I don't want to do that. I just really don't. She said, oh, it'll be okay. Just pray what Mama prays. He said, okay. So the preacher comes over and they talk for a little bit. Then it's time to eat. And it's time to bless the food. And the little boy bows his head and he says, Dear Lord, why did I invite these people to my house? So be careful what you pray for, because you might just get it. Look at these pictures behind me. And feel free to talk. What do all these pictures have in common? What do all these things have in common? They're monuments. Okay? They stand for something, don't they? They're very recognizable. How recognizable are we? Do people just look at us as just another person? Or do people see us as a monument? A testimony to something that has happened. Alex read 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4, 5, and 12. And we're going to talk about living stones. We're going to talk about the difference in what it means to be a living stone versus a standing stone. So hopefully you can take from this morning and just reflect on what your life is. Are we like those monuments that stick out? Or are we just something that just another face to look at? Are we just something that may be a little out of the ordinary, but nobody knows anything about? Nobody knows what we're here for. Standing stones are something historically that are very common. Typically what you would see is a large stone or a group of stones. A lot of times they were big enough that you would be able to see them from a distance. If they were smaller, they would stack them. And the reason they did that was exactly what we saw in the pictures. To memorialize a person, an event, a particular place. It has a special meaning for that particular culture. So, something happened, something important. They would take these stones and literally, if they were large enough, they would stand them up. So that whoever came by would know that something important happened in that spot. Somebody important was there. They'd raise these stones, and then the story of what that means would be passed down from generation to generation orally. A lot of times they didn't inscribe certain things. But if you know anything about geography, and if these things are left out in the weather, even if they inscribe them, within 4, 5, 6 generations, the inscriptions are gone, more than likely. And before long, nobody knew what those were for. Nobody knew the story behind why those huge stones are standing there. Nobody knew the story of why there's a stack of rocks beside a river, on top of a hill, in the middle of town. And this happened not just with God's people, but this was an old tradition that what the Bible would call pagans, or cultures that were not part of God's chosen race and the Israelites. The Hebrew word that the Israelites used for this concept was maseba, which literally means to set up or to stand up. And that was the concept. If you were an Israelite and you mentioned that word, you knew exactly the concept. You knew exactly the image that portrayed in your mind. You may have to ask somebody, hey, what does this mean? But that was the whole point. You raise something up, you set something up that's visible, so that somebody, when they come across, they're going to ask you, hey, what happened over here? You know, we're driving along I remember going to Jonathan's wedding up in York, Nebraska. And if you know anything about the landscape from Oklahoma City, pretty much all the way through Kansas and Nebraska, you can see for quite a while. And driving through central Kansas on the interstate, out in the middle of a field, was a chimney. And I thought, house burned down, house fell down. There's something there. Something happened there. There was a house there. It was a symbol that was left. And that's what these people did. They wanted people to ask. But before long, people didn't know. You know, we look at Stonehenge today. How many of you in here know exactly what Stonehenge was for? Okay? Nobody knows. We can take our best guess. Gene, go to the next slide, please. In Gezer, over in Israel, through excavations, archaeologists discovered this now incomplete. Some are laid over, but these are standing stones, and you can't quite tell, but most of these are 20 feet tall above the ground. And the interesting thing that they found was that there's 20 feet below the ground. So these were put there purposefully to stay there. But guess what? Nobody knows why they're there. They did when they erected those stones, and these things were, as best we can tell, some erected somewhere prior to 3000 BC. Huge, tall, towering stones. But that's all they are now. Why? Because nobody knows what they're there for. Nobody knows their reason for being. Nobody knows the story behind what happened. What that is a memorial to. So what is that what does that say? What should that say for us in our lives? That are we like one of those? We're just another rock, some larger than others, some in better shape than others? Or do people see us and know exactly what's happened with us? Whose we are? Why we do what we do? Why we're here on this earth? And who we live for? We'll look at some biblical examples of these standing stones. Remember Jacob, who wrestled with God, who became the father of the Israelite nation, literally. 2 different times. Genesis chapter 28 and Genesis chapter 35, at the same place. Jacob erects standing stones. And his were, more than likely, it was just him that did it, so they weren't near as big as the ones at Gezer. But they were large enough and they were designed and placed in a specific part of Bethel that people would know something important happened here. And if they asked Jacob, and if they asked his family members, he could tell them, and then they could tell somebody else what happened there. And you think about Moses after the Israelites left Egypt. Moses is on the mountain for 40 days. And after receiving the 10 Commandments, Moses comes down and he places 12 stones at the base of Mount Sinai. Something important happened. Moses talked to God. Moses met with God on that mountain, and God gave Moses the law for his people. And then later, in that Exodus from Egypt, when the Israelites are crossing over into the Promised Land, they cross the River Jordan, which, by the way, was at flood stage. That's a whole other sermon. We're not going to go there. But as they were crossing, God instructed Joshua to pick 12 people, one from each tribe, grab the biggest stone you can find in the riverbed as you're going along, and when you get to the other side, make a standing stone. Stack those up. And that's what they did. They stacked them up so that anybody that came by, there might not be anybody there at the time, but they would know, hey, something important happened right here. You drive through, one of these days, Jocelyn's going to kill me because we're going to drive through Texas and I'm going to stop at every one of those historical markers. Because I want to know what happened. Do we want people to know what happened with us? Do we want people to see what it is that makes us do what we do? Or do we want to be like those stones at Gezer that they're just there? They're silent. I want you to read this passage with me one more time. 1 Peter 2, 4, 5, and 12. This is from the NIV version. As you come to Him, the living stone, rejected by men, but chosen by God and precious to Him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. Peter, in writing this, and his audience reading this, didn't have to explain the concept. They knew exactly what he was talking about. Peter is calling his audience, and that includes us today. It's not just for the first century Christians. He's calling us to be, as Matthew chapter 5 verse 16 says, a light. Not just a standing stone, but a living standing stone. A living monument to God. So that when somebody sees us, they know exactly why we do what we do. They know exactly what God has done in our lives. And folks, it's not the easiest thing to do, but that also has to involve us telling somebody what has happened. That was the whole concept of a standing stone, was to pique somebody's curiosity. Hey, what happened here? I'm going to go find out. I'm going to ask somebody. If somebody asks you, hey, why are you so happy? Why do you pray before you eat? Are you going to tell them? Or are you just going to stand there? Shrug your shoulders. Peter is calling us to be more than just something to look at. Live the kind of life that is a testimony to what God has done for us and to what God can do for others. In the New Living Translation, in verse 4, the first phrase, the living stone, the New Living Translation says, the living cornerstone. Those of you that know anything about carpentry and construction, especially at this time and before, when you built with stones, that cornerstone was the most important piece in that building, whatever it was. If you got it off, if it wasn't the right kind of stone, your whole thing was off. That's what God has set up in Jesus. Jesus is the cornerstone of His temple, of His church, for us to be built on top of, to witness, to testify for God. We're not, as Peter says here in verse 12, live such good lives among the pagans that they will know that because of what you do, the way that you live your life, they will glorify God. We've seen it over and over in Scripture. That because of what God did for His people, that caused people that didn't know anything about God to glorify Him. You think about all He did with Daniel and the Babylonian kings and later the Persian kings. They didn't believe in that concept of one true God. But they, after meeting Daniel, they understood what that meant. If we live our lives in such a way that we are called to, the world will know exactly. They will know exactly what our reason for being and our reason for doing the things we do. We'll leave no doubt. Let's look at some comparisons, actually contrasts. in the standing stones as the concept in the Old Testament versus the living stones in the New Testament that Peter's talking about. The standing stones of the Old Testament were non-living objects. They were inanimate objects. They relied on somebody else to tell their story. They were rocks. It might have been single rocks or groups or stacks of rocks, but they couldn't tell their story. They were silent. Living stones, that's us. That's Christians. And we can tell our story. We can verbally tell our story. We can tell somebody face to face. We can put it on paper. And we can let everybody know what it is that drives us. The standing stones, the design, in some cases, they would chisel these rocks. They would get them just a certain way, and they would place them in a certain configuration. But it was man that did it. If we're living stones, we're not designing. We didn't design ourselves. God designed us. So we become, as Peter says, living stones, fashioned and placed in a particular point by God. And sometimes that's hard to accept. Like I said, the whole concept of a standing stone was to be visible, to be noticeable, to stand out, to pique the curiosity. And that's the whole purpose for us as Christians, is to live our lives in such a way that piques somebody's curiosity, that makes somebody ask, why do you do what you do? These standing stones were erected to honor, to praise, to glorify an event, a person, a particular place. And as living stones, we are doing that for God. We're not just standing there in the middle of a field. We're not just something to be looked at. You think about the rocks at the standing stones at Gezer. For a while, people knew. They knew exactly. They could go into that town and say, hey, what do those mean? What happened? But after a while, the story goes silent. 3, 4, 5, 600 years later, 6,000 years later possibly, today, nobody knows that story. Because the rocks can't tell that story. They have to have somebody else to tell that story. God has us to tell our story, to tell His story. So we become not silent, interesting landmarks, but we become living landmarks, living monuments for God. So what in the world does all this mean? I mentioned Matthew 5:16 before, and in 1 Peter 2:12 says pretty much the same thing. Live your life in such a way that people know who you are. People will glorify the God that you serve because of the things that you do, the way that you live your life, the way you talk, the way you treat others, the attitude that you have. You're different. You're holy. You're set apart. We're set up to tell God's story. Do you live your life like a silent standing stone, like those stones at Gezer? Are you just standing there in the middle of a field? Nobody knows what your story is. Nobody knows why you're here. Nobody knows anything about you. It may be because physically you just look a little different. You're taller, whatever. But does your life speak? Do people know? Can they look at you and can they know, either by you telling them or by the way that the example that you portray, why you're here? Can they tell, do they know your reason for being on this earth? Or do you live your life as Peter calls us to live our lives, as a living stone, a living standing stone, a living monument, a living landmark for God? A testimony to what He has done in our lives. And that's hard to do. Do you blend in? Or do you stick out like a sore thumb? How many of you love sticking out like a sore thumb? Okay, very few. Nobody wants, the world doesn't want us to stick out. We turn on the TV and all we see, we read the news, all we see is somebody messed up because they were trying to be like somebody else. They were trying to do what everybody else was doing. Our society, our world tells us, don't be different. But God tells us that's the only way to be. Be different. Take pride in that and tell people why you're different. That's a huge challenge for me. And if you're human, it's probably, the more you practice it, the better you get at it. The Olympics are going on, and the first weekend that they were going on, we're watching the different competitions, and Noah and Luke asked me, how do they do that? How do they do that so good? And about 6-7 times to the same question, it's a one-word answer. Practice. We're probably not going to be really good at being living stones for Jesus and for God if we don't practice. If we're just like the whole world, nobody's going to know our story. We can't wait for them to come to us. Some will, most won't. Jesus went. And Jesus tells us to go. And that's our challenge this morning and each and every second of our lives. To live, as Peter says, as living stones. Be a living landmark. Be a living testimony to what God has done for this world, what He can do for this world, what He's done for us. And that amazing promise that we have that if we obey Him, we're going somewhere far greater than we could ever imagine. And folks, that is not something to just sit and keep your mouth shut over. That's something to, something amazing happens. You get a huge promotion at work. You get an award, something. You want to go tell somebody. And we do a good job of that, getting excited about this, that, and the other, except what really matters. It's all well and good to get awards, to be recognized, to do a good job, but what a perfect opportunity to tell people, this is why I do what I do. I don't do it just because I want to get paid a bunch of money. I do it because God loves me. And let me tell you what He's done for me. This morning, if you need the prayers of the church for any reason, maybe you haven't obeyed God's calling. You haven't put Him on in baptism. Folks, there's no better time than right now. We're not guaranteed the next 2 seconds. If you need prayers for anything, if you feel the need to come forward and make those prayers public, feel free to do so. Seek somebody out. Find somebody that you can confide in and tell them what's going on. There's probably not a person in this audience that, if you were really struggling with something, that would just walk away from you. I feel pretty confident with that. Folks, if you have any need whatsoever this morning, if you feel compelled to come forward this morning, please do so as we sing this song.